They say every outlaw has a beginning, a moment when the line between right and wrong quietly fades away. But in the case of Ma Barker, that line wasn't crossed all at once. It eroded slowly, like a riverbank eaten by time, until what stood on the other side was something the world had never seen before. A mother who would raise America's most dangerous sons and build a criminal dynasty from her own kitchen table. Her story begins in the late 1800s, deep in the dusty heart of Missouri. Back then, her name was Arizona Donnie Clark, though folks called her Ari. She grew up in a world where hard work was survival, not virtue. Her family lived on land that was never quite theirs, scraping by on crops that never quite grew tall enough. The days were long, the winters cruel, and the only thing more reliable than the sunrise was the sound of men talking about dreams they'd never reach. Ari wasn't like the other girls. While they talked of marriage and church picnics, she watched the drifters and outlaws passing through town, men with fast tempers, faster guns, and eyes that held no fear of the law. Something in her admired them, not for their violence, but for their freedom. They took what they wanted, lived how they pleased, and answered to no one. That kind of power, that defiance, stuck with her. When she married George Barker, a poor tenant farmer, she thought she was stepping into the ordinary life expected of her. But ordinary never suited her. George was kind but weak, the sort of man who bent with every breeze. They had 4 sons, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, Doc, and Fred, and with each birth came another reason for Ari to fight harder against a world that gave her nothing. She wasn't the nurturing kind of mother, not the type to bake pies and hum lullabies. She was tough, sharp-tongued, and fiercely protective, the kind of woman who'd stare down a sheriff if she thought he'd wronged one of her boys. The Barkers moved often, chasing work, running from debt, and sometimes running from trouble. The boys grew up learning that rules were for other people. When they got into fights, Ari didn't punish them. She praised them for standing up for themselves. When they stole apples or trinkets from town, she called it making do. And when they got into real trouble with the law, she didn't ask them to stop. She blamed the law for being too harsh. Some neighbors whispered that Mrs. Barker was raising hoodlums. Others said she was just doing her best in hard times. But behind her closed doors, a certain fire was growing. She didn't just love her sons, she worshipped them. In her eyes, they could do no wrong. And if the world saw criminals, she saw survivors. By the time the Barker boys reached their teens, small crimes had turned into serious offenses. Petty thefts became burglaries. Fistfights turned into shootouts. And each time they got caught, their mother was right there in the courtroom, glaring at the judge, scolding the police, and spinning tales of misunderstanding. She had a way of twisting words, of making her sons sound like victims instead of villains. Some said she could charm a snake if it meant keeping her boys out of prison. But the truth was simpler. She believed in them with a blind, dangerous kind of love. The kind that doesn't see consequences until it's too late. In the early 1920s, the world was changing fast. Prohibition had turned the country into a playground for bootleggers and bank robbers. The law was stretched thin, and money flowed through criminal hands faster than ever before. The Barker boys were no longer just local troublemakers. They were part of something bigger, and their mother was right in the middle of it. When George Barker finally left the family, worn down by years of turmoil, Ari didn't shed a tear. She told her sons they didn't need him. "We're Barkers," she'd say, "and Barkers stick together." Those words became a kind of family creed, a moral compass pointed south. In those days they lived cheap, always moving, always hiding. Their houses were small, but Ma Barker made them feel like fortresses. She'd sit in a worn rocking chair by the window, cigarette smoke curling around her head like a crown, keeping watch for police cars or strangers. The neighbors called her Mother, not out of warmth, but out of fear. They said she had eyes in the back of her head, that she could sense trouble before it came, and maybe she could. Every mother wants to see her children succeed. But Ma Barker's idea of success came with gunfire and getaway cars. When Herman started robbing banks, she didn't scold him. She told him to be careful. When Lloyd got arrested, she told him to hold his head high. When Doc and Fred joined in, she made sure they all stayed close, even as their crimes grew bolder. She was their shelter, their strategist, and their shield. Some said she handled the money, others said she helped plan the jobs. Whether or not she truly led them didn't matter. The image stuck. A gray-haired woman commanding a band of killers. It was the stuff of nightmares and headlines. In the quiet hours, when the boys were gone and the house was still, Ma Barker would sit alone, her hands trembling slightly as she lit another cigarette. She'd think about the days when her sons were small enough to fit on her lap, before their names filled wanted posters. Maybe she wondered if she'd gone too far. Or maybe, just maybe, she felt proud that she'd raised men who wouldn't bow to anyone. The newspapers would later paint her as a mastermind, the brains of the Barker gang. But those who knew her back then told a different story. They said she wasn't clever, not in the way criminals are. She was stubborn, loyal, and driven by love twisted into obsession. Her power came not from intellect, but from something more primal, a mother's will to protect her own, no matter the cost. As the 1920s bled into the 1930s, the Barker name began to echo across the Midwest like a curse. Banks robbed, officers shot, witnesses silenced. And behind it all, rumors of a matriarch who'd do anything for her boys. She became a legend, part truth, part myth, and all menace. But for now she was still just a mother, sitting in the dim light of her parlor, waiting for her sons to come home from another job, humming an old hymn under her breath. The world outside was changing, darker, faster, more dangerous. But Ma Barker's grip on her family was unshakable. She had built a kingdom, not of gold or glory, but of blood. And though she couldn't see it yet, that kingdom was already cracking. Because love, no matter how fierce, can only hold back fate for so long. And when fate finally comes for you, it doesn't knock gently. The story of America's most dangerous mother had only just begun. By the early 1920s, the Barker name had become more than just a family. It was a warning whispered in small-town jails and sheriff's offices across the Midwest. Wherever the Barker boys went, trouble seemed to follow like smoke chasing fire. And in the center of that rising storm sat Ma Barker, watching it all unfold with pride and purpose, as if every crime committed by her sons was proof that they were finally getting what life had always denied her: respect, power, and fear. It began with Herman, the oldest. He was charming, handsome, and reckless, the kind of man who could grin at you while emptying your pockets. Herman had a quick temper, but quicker reflexes. He was a natural-born criminal, not because he loved crime, but because it loved him back. The law was a game to him, and every time he escaped capture, he'd send his mother a letter signed, "Your boy, still free." Fred and Doc followed his lead. Fred, with his quiet cunning, was the thinker. Doc, with his hot-headed nature, was the enforcer. Lloyd, the youngest, tried for a while to go straight. He joined the army, hoping to escape the shadow of his brothers. But war changed him. When he came back, scarred and bitter, the world had no place for him. So he too fell back into the family fold. Ma Barker didn't just watch this descent. She nurtured it. She cooked for them, hid them, and listened to their stories of robberies and escapes as though they were tales of heroism. When the boys brought home stolen cash, she didn't ask where it came from. She just made sure they had clean shirts and a warm bed. To her, they weren't criminals. They were survivors in a world that had cheated them first. As Prohibition tightened its grip on America, crime became an industry. The Barkers saw their chance. Herman started running with bootleggers, smuggling liquor through rural backroads at night. Fred and Doc teamed up with other outlaws, bank robbers, car thieves, and killers looking for easy money. Their network spread across state lines, a tangled web of criminals bound by greed and desperation. And through it all, Ma Barker was there. She wasn't the one pulling the trigger, but she pulled the family together. Whenever one of her sons got into trouble, she'd pack up and move closer, renting a small house under a new name. Her neighbors would see a polite older woman with gray hair and gentle eyes knitting by the window. They never guessed that her home was a sanctuary for fugitives. There was something almost maternal about her loyalty to their crimes. If one of her sons got arrested, she'd visit the jail with homemade food and letters of encouragement. If They escaped. She'd hide them in her home until the heat died down. And if the law came sniffing around, she'd lie without flinching. To the world, she was Ma, the innocent old lady who couldn't possibly be involved. But to her sons, she was the rock they built their empire on. In 1927, everything changed. Herman was cornered by police after a botched robbery in Wichita, Kansas. Rather than face prison, he turned his gun on himself. The news hit the Barkers like a bullet through the heart, but Ma didn't cry. She just sat silent, smoking one cigarette after another, her face hard as stone. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat and cold. "They took one of mine," she said. "The world owes us blood." That was the moment her motherly love hardened into something else. The grief didn't break her, it sharpened her. She pushed the remaining boys closer together, telling them Herman's death had to mean something. "We're all that's left," she told them. "We stick together or we die alone." With Herman gone, Fred stepped up as the new leader. He was calmer, more methodical, but just as ruthless. He and Doc began working with Barker-Karpis, a small-time crook with a brain for logistics and a taste for chaos. Together they formed what would soon become the Barker-Karpis Gang, a name that would strike fear into everyone from Kansas City to Chicago. They robbed banks, hijacked shipments, and kidnapped millionaires. Every move they made was bolder than the last, and each time they seemed to vanish into thin air. The FBI would later call them one of the most organized criminal gangs in the country. But in those early days, their secret weapon wasn't cunning or firepower. It was Ma Barker's loyalty. She rented safe houses under fake names, managed the cash, and made sure no one in the gang talked out of turn. She'd host dinners where the men would laugh and plan their next jobs while she refilled their plates and kept an ear on every word. Some said she didn't understand the full extent of their crimes. Others believed she was the glue that held their criminal empire together. The truth probably sat somewhere in between. She wasn't the cold, calculating mastermind the FBI would later claim. But she was no bystander either. She knew her boys were dangerous. She saw the guns, the blood, and the fear in their eyes after every job. But instead of turning away, she embraced it. To her, crime had become a family business, and she was the matriarch protecting her own. In those years, the Barkers drifted from one hideout to another, Minnesota, Missouri, Oklahoma, each move a desperate step ahead of the law. They lived well for criminals. Fancy clothes, cars, and cash flowed through their hands like water. Yet no matter how far they ran, Ma Barker made sure the home felt familiar. The curtains were drawn, the coffee always hot, and the doors always locked. But even in the comfort of their safe houses, the shadows never really lifted. There was tension between the brothers. Fred's growing ambition, Doc's temper, Lloyd's drinking. Fights broke out, sometimes over money, sometimes over pride. And each time, Ma stepped in like a referee in a holy war, reminding them that family came first. She'd say, "No one in this world will ever love you like your own blood." That line became her gospel. Yet love alone couldn't keep the law at bay. By 1931, Lloyd was captured and sent to Leavenworth. Doc and Fred were wanted across multiple states. Their faces appeared on wanted posters, their names in the newspapers, and still, Ma Barker stayed by their side. She was the quiet constant. In a life of chaos, the mother of crime, wrapped in a shawl and soaked in sin. The authorities couldn't believe she was just a bystander. J. Edgar Hoover himself would later call her the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade. But those who met her described her as polite, even gentle. There was a strange contradiction in her, a grandmotherly figure who'd smile sweetly while sitting on a sofa stacked with stolen cash. And somewhere, deep down, maybe she still believed she was just protecting her family, that the world had turned its back on them long before they ever broke the law. As the Barker boys' crimes grew more violent, Ma's role as their protector turned into something almost mythic. She was their moral compass in a world without morals, their shelter in every storm. But the storms were getting worse. The bodies were piling up. The money was running thin, and the FBI was closing in, one breadcrumb at a time. Ma Barker couldn't stop what was coming. She could only do what she'd always done, keep her sons close, keep the law guessing, and pray that somehow the love of a mother could outsmart the wrath of the world. But even she knew. You can't hide from the wind forever. The Barker-Karpis Gang was rising, and soon the whole nation would know the name Ma Barker. By the early 1930s, America was in chaos. The Great Depression had turned honest men into beggars, and beggars into thieves. Banks were the villains in the eyes of the desperate, and every outlaw who robbed one was hailed as a kind of dark hero, a rebel standing against the system. But among the countless names that filled the newspapers, none stirred more fear than the Barker-Karpis Gang. They weren't just robbers. They were a family bound by blood and violence, moving like ghosts across the Midwest. In the center of it all was Fred Barker, now hardened and calculating, and his partner in crime, Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, a man with sharp eyes, a mind like a trap, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Together, they built a criminal empire that left trails of blood and money from Chicago to Kansas City. But what made them legendary wasn't just their crimes. It was the strange figure who followed them from one hideout to the next, a gray-haired woman who the newspapers would come to call Ma Barker. To the gang, she was more than a mother. She was a protector, a symbol, a living reminder of loyalty in a world that rewarded betrayal. When tensions ran high, Ma's voice would cut through the noise like a whip. "You boys remember who you are," she'd say. "We're family first. Everything else comes after." They lived in a strange kind of comfort, stolen luxury. In those days, the Barkers and their crew would move into small towns under fake names, renting modest houses that didn't draw attention. The furniture was plain, the curtains always closed, and the cash hidden in the floorboards. Neighbors would see an elderly woman watering the flowers, smiling politely, and think nothing of it. They had no idea that behind those lace curtains, America's most wanted criminals were planning their next heist. The Barker-Karpis Gang's operations were efficient and brutal. They hit banks with precision, moving fast and vanishing before the police could react. When their robberies grew too risky, they shifted to a darker trade, kidnapping. Wealthy businessmen were their prey now, and ransom money came quicker than bank loot ever could. The 1933 abduction of William Ham, heir to a Minnesota brewery fortune, brought them a staggering $100,000. Not long after, they kidnapped banker Edward Bremer for an even bigger score, $200,000 in cash. It was a dangerous game, but the payoffs made them bold. Ma Barker wasn't in the room when the guns were drawn or the victims bound, but she knew everything. Her boys talked freely around her, boasting, laughing, even arguing over how to split the cash. Some gang members said she handled the money. Others said she managed their safe houses. But every man in the crew knew one thing. You didn't cross Ma Barker. She might not shoot you herself, but her sons would. And that was worse. There were nights when the safe houses felt almost peaceful. Ma would sit at the kitchen table, knitting while the boys cleaned their guns and counted bills. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and nervous laughter. Outside, crickets sang in the dark. Inside, the family that robbed America's rich lived like a twisted version of domestic bliss. Fred often sought his mother's approval. He'd show her newspaper clippings about their crimes, reading the headlines aloud as if bragging about a school award. Ma would nod, half proud, half wary. "They can write what they want," she'd say softly, "as long as they can't catch you." But pride has a way of clouding judgment. The more famous they became, the more reckless they grew. They began to leave traces, witnesses, license plates, small mistakes that didn't matter much alone, but built a trail for the FBI to follow. In Washington, J. Edgar Hoover took notice. The Barker-Karpis Gang had humiliated local police too many times, and Hoover needed a public victory. He made them his personal target. The Bureau began compiling reports, tracking stolen cars, intercepted letters, and even following the flow of ransom payments. Bit by bit, the net began to close. Meanwhile, inside the gang, tensions simmered. Karpis was the brains, and Fred knew it. He resented taking orders from anyone outside the family, but even he couldn't deny that Karpis kept them alive. Doc, now more ruthless than ever, handled the violent side of things: intimidation, executions, cleanups, and Ma. She tried to keep the peace, but the peace was fragile. In 1934, the kidnapping of Edward Bremer proved to be their undoing. The ransom had been huge, but the attention was bigger. The victim was well connected, and the government threw everything it had into finding the culprits. Informants began to whisper. Associates turned nervous, and the Barkers' perfect hideouts started to feel more like traps. The family moved constantly, from Chicago to St. Paul, then down south to Florida. Each new house felt smaller, quieter. The laughter grew thinner, the paranoia thicker. Fred started drinking more, and Ma's hands trembled when she lit her cigarettes. Still, she stayed by his side. When others left the gang, when the money ran low, when the news called them monsters, Ma Barker stayed. Because that's what mothers do. But the woman the FBI painted, the criminal mastermind commanding her sons with an iron fist, that wasn't the Ma Barker her gang knew. She wasn't scheming or manipulative. She was maternal, overbearing, and fiercely loyal. Her power came from her influence, not her intellect. When Hoover's agents finally pieced together her name, they imagined a cunning puppet master. What they found instead was a woman whose greatest crime was her refusal to let go. Still, to the public, she became a symbol. The idea of a mother leading her sons into bloodshed fascinated and horrified America. Newspapers called her the mother of evil, Bloody Mama, and the woman behind the gun. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The myth was too powerful to resist. As the FBI closed in, Ma and Fred settled into a 2-story lakeside house in Ocklawaha, Florida, their final refuge. The others scattered, taking what money they could and leaving behind a trail of bodies and betrayal. The house in Florida was meant to be temporary, a quiet place to disappear. But fate, as always, had other plans. In those final months of 1934, Ma's world had shrunk to a few rooms and a few people. She spent her days reading, cooking simple meals, and sitting by the window, watching the stillness of the water. Fred grew restless. He'd talk about new heists, new hideouts, new starts. But deep down, he knew the game was over. Sometimes at night, when the wind rustled through the pines, Ma would hum softly, an old hymn from her childhood. Fred would smile faintly, remembering simpler times, before the guns, before the blood. In those moments, they almost looked like any mother and son, sitting quietly in a house by the lake. But outside, the Bureau was already watching. They had traced the ransom money, identified the aliases, and followed the trail right to their door. The storm that had been building for years was finally about to break, and when it did, it would do so with the full force of the United States government. For now, though Ma Barker sat in her rocking chair, the Florida sunlight soft on her face, unaware that her legend was about to be written in gunfire. The reign of the Barker-Karpis Gang was nearly over, and its queen mother, whether villain or victim, would soon meet her final reckoning. The dawn of January 16, 1935, crept over the still waters of Lake Weir in Ocklawaha, Florida, with the kind of eerie calm that only comes before a storm. The small lakeside house stood quiet, its windows dark, its occupants still asleep inside. From a distance it looked ordinary, the home of an aging widow and her son maybe. But in truth it was the last refuge of America's most wanted criminals, Fred Barker and his mother, the infamous Ma Barker. For months the FBI had been closing in. The ransom money from their kidnappings had been traced. Associates had turned informants, and the Barker name had become a headline of terror from coast to coast. J. Edgar Hoover wanted a show of force, a victory to prove his bureau's reach and power. And now he had it. The agents arrived quietly before dawn, surrounding the house from all sides. They came armed to the teeth, Tommy guns, rifles, shotguns, crouching behind trees and vehicles as they waited for the command. Inside, Fred and Ma slept soundly, unaware that their time had run out. When the first knock came, it wasn't polite. It was the sharp, booming voice of authority cutting through the morning stillness. "Fred Barker, you're surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Silence. Then from inside, a woman's voice, old, cracked, and defiant. "You'll never take us alive." That voice, the agents would later claim, was Ma Barker's. Whether it truly was or not, no one could ever prove. But what came next left no room for doubt. Gunfire erupted. The first burst shattered the morning calm, echoing across the water. Bullets ripped through the walls, splintering wood and shattering glass. Inside, Fred returned fire with a Thompson submachine gun, spraying blindly through the windows. The sound was deafening, a thunderstorm made of lead. For nearly 4 hours, the battle raged. The agents fired hundreds of rounds, and the Barkers answered with everything they had. Smoke poured from the house as the morning sun rose higher, casting long shadows over the carnage. Neighbors miles away would later say it sounded like a war. Inside, Ma Barker crouched beside her son. She wasn't a warrior, not really, but she refused to run. Maybe she thought she was protecting him. Maybe she thought surrender meant humiliation. Or maybe, after all those years of defying the world, she simply didn't know how to give up. Fred shouted orders, his voice growing hoarse, his gun barrel hot. "Keep shooting, Ma! Don't let him in!" She reloaded for him, her trembling hands steadying long enough to pass him fresh ammunition. Every few minutes, the FBI called for them to surrender. Every time, gunfire was their only answer. The standoff stretched on until nearly noon. The Florida air was heavy with heat and smoke. The agents, hidden behind trees and cars, could see little through the haze. Finally, the order came down from headquarters. Finish it. A final volley tore through the house, bullets shredding walls and furniture alike. When the smoke cleared, silence settled once more. The agents waited, guns still aimed, hearts pounding. No sound came from inside. No movement. When they finally approached, the house was a ruin. Holes riddled every wall. Smoke curled from the shattered windows. Inside, they found Fred Barker sprawled on the floor, a rifle still clutched in his hand, his body riddled with bullets. Nearby, in a small bedroom, lay Ma Barker, lifeless, a pistol beside her, a faint trace of defiance still frozen in her expression. The battle was over. America's most wanted mother and son were dead. Word spread fast. By evening, the newspapers were running bold headlines. Ma Barker killed in gun battle with FBI. Photos of the bullet-ridden house made front pages across the country. The Bureau painted it as a triumph, the fall of the woman who had masterminded one of the most dangerous criminal gangs in U.S. history. Hoover himself declared that Ma Barker was the real brains behind the Barker-Karpis Gang, the criminal matriarch, who had led her sons into lives of blood and sin. But not everyone believed it. Neighbors, who had known her in those final months, described a gentle old woman who spent her days reading and cooking. They said she was polite, quiet, even sweet. Some of the gang's surviving members later insisted she wasn't involved at all, that she didn't plan the crimes, didn't command the men, didn't even know half of what her sons were doing. Karpis himself, years later, would laugh at Hoover's claim, saying, "Ma couldn't plan breakfast, let alone a bank robbery." Still, truth and legend rarely part ways once they meet. The FBI needed a symbol, and Ma Barker became one. She was transformed from a grieving mother into a monstrous figure of authority, the evil matron who turned her sons into killers. It made for good headlines, and it gave the public someone to hate, someone to fear. But the real story was far messier. The woman lying dead in that bullet-riddled Florida house was not a criminal mastermind. She was a mother who had lost 3 sons to violence, and now lay beside the last one. Whether she fired a gun that day or not, it no longer mattered. The myth had already taken shape. As the FBI photographed the scene, agents stood among the debris, the scattered furniture, the broken dishes, the overturned Bible on the nightstand. On the wall, a few family photos still hung crooked, their glass cracked but the faces inside smiling. One of them showed Ma and her boys from years earlier, young, carefree, before the crimes, before the blood. The bodies were taken to the local morgue, where curious townsfolk came to see the infamous Ma Barker. Some said she looked peaceful, others said she looked mean. But one thing was certain: the woman who had defied the law, raised killers, and fought the federal government to her last breath had finally met her end. The Bureau paraded the victory in the papers, claiming the Barkers' reign of terror was over. And in a sense it was. Doc Barker would later be caught, tried, and sentenced to life. Lloyd would die years later, broken and forgotten. Karpis alone would survive long enough to tell the tale, serving decades behind bars before being released. But Ma Barker's story, even in death, refused to fade. In the years that followed, she became something larger than life. A symbol of twisted motherhood, the dark mirror of the American dream. Movies would paint her as a gun-toting matriarch commanding her sons into murder. Songs would romanticize her defiance, and the FBI would forever use her as proof of their strength, their reach, their righteousness. But beneath all that myth, the truth remained buried under the rubble of that Florida house. Ma Barker wasn't the leader of a gang. She was its shadow, A woman too loyal to abandon her sons, too stubborn to walk away, and too proud to surrender. In the end, she got what she always wanted, to never be separated from her boys. But it came at a cost that no mother could bear. As the agents left the scene, one of them reportedly turned back and looked at the lake, still, silent, glistening under the afternoon sun. The echoes of gunfire had long since faded, replaced by the soft ripple of water against the shore. He muttered, almost to himself, "She went down fighting." Whether that was admiration or relief, no one could tell. All that was certain was this: the legend of Ma Barker, America's most dangerous mother, had been sealed in blood and smoke, and though her body was gone, her ghost would haunt the dark corners of American history for decades to come. The smoke had barely cleared from the house by Lake Weir, but the name Ma Barker was already etched into the legends of American crime. Reporters swarmed the scene like vultures, their cameras flashing over the bullet-riddled walls, the broken windows, the still body of a woman who had been called both a mother and a monster. The air was thick with myth before the truth had even settled. And as the nation stared at those haunting images, a single question lingered. Who was Ma Barker, really? The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover himself, painted her as the mastermind, the ruthless matriarch of the Barker-Karpis Gang. They said she planned the kidnappings, directed the robberies, and ordered men to kill without hesitation. She was, in Hoover's words, the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade. It was a statement that would define her forever, one that turned her from a mother into a symbol. But like many stories told in the aftermath of chaos, there was another side, one that whispered through the cracks of official reports. Neighbors who'd known her in Missouri remembered a different woman. They spoke of Kate Barker as quiet, church-going, a bit bossy perhaps, but certainly not a criminal genius. To them, she was a mother who had lost control of her sons, a woman dragged into a storm she couldn't stop. To others, especially those who'd seen the Barkers rise firsthand, she was complicit. She had housed fugitives, shielded them from the law, and enjoyed the spoils of their crimes. Maybe she didn't pull the trigger, but she was there when the smoke cleared, every time. Truth, in the end, is a fickle thing. It bends under the weight of fear, pride, and legend. And Ma Barker's legend grew fast. Newspapers loved the story. The idea that a gray-haired woman could command killers made for perfect headlines. The press didn't just report the crime. They shaped it. "Public enemy number one, a mother," screamed one front page. Others called her the deadliest mom in America. The image stuck. An aging woman with her sons around her, like a dark parody of a family portrait. But somewhere between the headlines and the truth lay the real Kate Barker, a woman whose life had spiraled beyond control, tangled in the chaos of her children's ambitions. Alvin Karpis, her partner in crime and one of the most cunning men of that era, later claimed the FBI's version was exaggerated. Ma wasn't no mastermind, he said years later. She couldn't plan breakfast. According to him, she was a mother who simply refused to abandon her boys, no matter how deep they fell into sin. She cooked, she cleaned, she cursed the law, but she wasn't the brains. Still, Karpis admitted something chilling. Her presence made the men fearless. When Ma was around, he said, the boys felt untouchable. Maybe that was her power, not strategy, but devotion. She gave her sons a sense of invincibility, the illusion that family could protect them from the world. But illusions are fragile things. By the time they holed up in that lakeside house in Florida, the illusion had already cracked. The gang was in shambles. Most of their partners were dead, captured, or hiding under new names. The Barkers were living on borrowed time. The FBI's version of the final standoff was dramatic, like something ripped straight from a gangster film. They claimed agents surrounded the house at dawn, demanding surrender. Inside, Ma and her son Fred opened fire, sparking a furious gunfight that lasted nearly 5 hours. Thousands of rounds were fired. When the smoke cleared, both were dead. Hoover announced to the press that the FBI had taken down the nation's most dangerous woman. It was perfect publicity, a clean victory, a headline that would echo for years. But later, witnesses offered a more tragic account. Some said Ma Barker never fired a gun, that she sat frozen in a chair, clutching a machine gun she didn't even know how to use. That Fred was the one shooting, wild and desperate, refusing to surrender while his mother screamed at him to stop. When the bullets finally silenced the house, Ma lay still beside her son. A mother and child united in death as they had been in crime. The truth may never be known. The FBI had no recordings, no photographs of her firing back. Only Hoover's word and the word of his men stood between reality and legend. But Hoover had a reason to craft a story. The 1930s were an era of chaos, of public fear and criminal fame. Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd, they had all made the Bureau look weak. Hoover needed a victory, and Ma Barker's death gave him one. The story of a deadly criminal mother who fell to the law made the FBI look decisive, powerful, righteous. It reminded America that no outlaw, not even a mother, could escape justice. As years passed, Ma Barker's tale morphed into something larger than life. Hollywood adapted her story again and again, each version darker, bloodier, more dramatic. She became an archetype, the criminal mother, the manipulative matriarch, the woman who ruled her family with an iron will. But beneath all the exaggeration, something human lingered, the raw, painful truth of a mother's love twisted by desperation. She had raised her sons in poverty, during a time when the world gave women few choices and even fewer chances. Her husband had left. The law had failed her family long before she defied it. And when her boys turned to crime, she chose to follow rather than abandon them. That decision, simple and human, sealed her fate. In her mind, she was protecting her children. In the eyes of the world, she became their accomplice. Perhaps that's what makes her story endure. Not the violence, not the myth, but the question it leaves behind. How far would a mother go for her children? Would she look away from their sins? Hide their crimes? Stand beside them, even in the line of fire? For Ma Barker, the answer was yes. Always yes. In the end, the FBI left her body on display for hours, a warning to others who dared defy the law. Reporters came and went, snapping photos of her lifeless form, the gangster mother, slain beside her son. But those who looked closely saw something the papers didn't mention. Her hand still rested near Fred's, the two of them frozen together, family even in death. Ma Barker's story is a mirror held up to America's fascination with crime and loyalty. Some see her as a monster, others as a victim of myth-making. But perhaps she was something simpler, a woman consumed by love and fear, who crossed every line trying to hold her family together. And though decades have passed, her ghost still lingers in the American imagination, whispering through the cracks of truth and legend alike. Maybe she wasn't the criminal mastermind they claimed. Maybe she was something far more dangerous, a mother who refused to let go. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history. Stories where truth, myth, and madness collide.